Well, what did happen to her?
She's gone.
What do you mean, gone?
Maybe we could find her.
You here by yourself?
Stay away from him!
God damn it, quit moving.
Who are you, and what do you want?
Hi everyone, and welcome back to OCN Writer's Room. I'm your host, Andre Gilbert, and today we're doing our first Zoom interview with sci-fi screenwriter David Liban.
Hello.
Awesome. All right, David, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your experiences? What sort of projects do you work on?
Oh boy, I just am coming off a feature film that I created and I produced and directed. I've made feature films before that were of documentary nature, and this is my first feature film that's a narrative, and I've been working on it for about 4 years. It's called A Feral World, and it's a post-apocalyptic coming-of-age story, essentially, and we shot it similar in style to the film Boyhood, in that the main character ages over the course of the film. So we shot it each year in successive years for 4 years. So our lead character started out as 11 and was 15 when we did our final shoot last summer. And so, I can tell you more about the film when you're ready, but that's the crux of it.
Yeah, awesome. So if you actually want to go ahead and talk with us a little bit more about that, you mentioned that it's a coming-of-age story. So
Yeah.
beyond just the main character getting older as the film progresses, what sort of coming-of-age themes or narratives are you exploring in the context of that film?
So the boy is alone and presumed orphaned. The world has been destroyed by some evil technology. And he comes across a woman in his pursuits who is searching for her daughter who's gone missing, has been abducted. And they travel together to help find her and rescue her. The coming of age, so it's a boy alone who has braces in a world where there's no dentists. And so what does that mean, and how do you function? He's got no family. And so a bond forms between the woman and him, the boy. And it's their joining, their bonding in dystopia, essentially. And he ages and becomes a teenager, and he becomes self-sufficient, and she tries to train him to survive by using weapons and how to hunt and how to rummage and scavenge.
Sure. So you mentioned then that you shot it over the course of, you said 4 years, 5 years?
4 years.
So how do you feel that your approach to that narrative's changed over the course of that? Like, do you feel like you're a different filmmaker, or you're working on a different project now than when you first started?
Am I a different filmmaker? So let me try to wrap my head around the question. So the question, am I a different filmmaker? No, but my process of writing has changed, because that film started out as a one-off. Like, we did one episode and it was done. I thought that was it. But then we all were really sort of thinking that there's more story to tell. So I then worked on the film over the course of the years. And then my first 2 episodes, I had Craig Volk, a colleague of mine at CU Denver, who gave me a lot of really good help in writing the first 2. And then I wrote the final episodes 3 and 4 on my own. And that was a different process, because I didn't know we were going to go anywhere beyond that first episode. So I kind of had to figure out what is the end game, and then how do I write my way into that corner. And so there was a lot of variables, and who is the daughter, and where is she, and what happened to her. So we kind of figured that out as I went along.
Sure. So without picking too much then into like specific plot points, Is there anything that you wish you would have known or could do differently when you were working on that first film, now that it's evolved into a multi-year thing?
Probably. Let me think about that. Yeah, I may have chosen not to have a dog in the movie because we had to keep coming back to that dog.
And that means your shooting process was several decades in dog years too, right?
That's right. Yes. I look at the movie and it's hard for me to think about what I would have written different in that first one, other than I probably would have introduced the daughter sooner. She just mentions her in the first one. And so that was sort of a jumping point for me when I was sitting down to write the next episodes. So there was, okay, we know she has a daughter. We don't know if she's dead or alive. And I kind of built off of that.
Sure. So kind of peeling out a bit then, and when you first started working on this film, you probably couldn't have anticipated how our relationship with post-apocalyptic media would have changed between 2018 and 2020. So
yes, I'm a prophet.
So with the phrase post-apocalyptic, or just apocalyptic, or a lot of synonyms for it being used to describe day-to-day a lot now, how do you think that's changed our appetite for apocalyptic media?
That's very interesting. I mean, I think there's a fan fiction base out there for this genre. This is not a zombie movie, but I mean, I think that it's a distant cousin of a zombie movie.
Sure.
So I think there is an appetite for that type of genre. I don't know if that necessarily means that people won't tune into it because it hits too close to home. I think we're at a time where we've been locked away for several months now. We've seen everything we want. And so, it's actually helpful for the indie filmmakers like myself. The timing worked out well for me because the film was done by the time we got shut down. And so there's content being needed and sought after. So the distribution helped a great deal. You look at a movie like Soderbergh's Contagion, and that movie really hits home about, people dying in a much more horrible way than in reality. But that movie when we all got locked down, that movie just resurfaced and everybody was watching it. So I like to believe that it won't, be something that oh boy, I live too close to this. I don't want to watch that. But, I think if the movie's good, people will like it. That's kind of my thinking.
For sure. Well, I'd actually like to pick your brain a bit more on that then, because you mentioned this is an interesting time for indie filmmaking. I believe that the highest grossing movie by theatrical metrics this last month was a indie horror movie that two guys shot on Zoom. And by virtue of the fact that they had a theater rented out, they could show it to empty seats, and that made it the most successful theater movie of the month by virtue of the fact that it didn't have any competition. And I mean, that hopefully isn't the model for theaters moving forward. But do you think that how do you think this is forcing us to, I'm going to rewind this question a bit. How do you think this is changing our relationship to how films are premiered or how indie movies are circulated? Do you think there's more of an appetite because of this?
It's a complicated situation because I don't think anyone has the answer to that yet.
Sure.
I would say though that with the theaters being closed, there is more. I think there's something like 30% more streaming going on than there was before the pandemic. So I think if anything, there's going to be when we are allowed to go back into the theater and not worry about who's sitting next to us, I think people are going to flock to the theater. But for indie filmmakers, we sort of gave up on that route a long time ago. The idea of getting my film into a movie theater, unless I'm four-walling it myself, I don't think that there's a great market for it. So I didn't even really consider that. I was thinking from streaming from the get-go. I'm not sure. Did I answer your question? Or
yeah, I believe so. I mean, as much as it's a question.
Do you want to fine-tune it? Yeah.
As much as it's a question that even has answers, because what do you think things will look like a couple months from now is just not something we've had any collective luck with as a civilization.
True. But I would say, though, I think that, indie filmmaking has basically been shut down prior to this. Like Hollywood basically killed it. Like independent films that they show in Sundance are not really independent films. I mean, they say that the movie's got $10 million and it's a low budget movie. That to me is, not an indie film. That's a studio picture. But, by their standards, that's not a lot of money. But to a true indie filmmaker, that's crazy amount of money. But because we're seeing more people making movies on their own, I think that this is a kind of a good time for indie filmmakers to really get out there and get noticed because we're not competing with Hollywood at the moment.
I get that. Are you excited for around this time next year when we'll have like 600-700 film festival movies that have been like all shot on Zoom, or all have the word quarantine in their name somewhere?
I'm expecting a lot of videos of, this is what I did during the pandemic, and no one's going to care, sadly, because we're,
very depressing, reflective vlog of someone's life, for sure.
Yes.
So before we sat down for the interview, you mentioned that you had another project in the pipelines that was departing a bit from your post-apocalyptic sci-fi, and I understand this one's a dark comedy. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
For sure. I wrote during the pandemic. That was what I did. I sat down and I wrote. And I mean, I kind of planned on that prior to the pandemic happening. So it just happened to coincide with that. But I wrote a dark comedy, thinking greatly about the resources I had available to me. I'm also a professor at CU Denver, and one of the things I often have my students read is this book by Robert Rodriguez called Rebel Without a Crew. And what I really like about that book is about him making El Mariachi, was that he wrote this script basically in quarantine. In his situation, he was like a lab rat in some sort of testing facility for some dermatological creams. But he wrote a script based on the things that he had available to him. And I kind of did that with Feral also. Like I did that with that movie, but I didn't, costumes and locations were kind of different. This film takes place in an academic environment, and it's very manageable as far as the resources. So it takes place in academia. It's about a college professor who is coming up for tenure, and he has a lot of struggles along the way that end up deadly. So I kind of compare it to Burn After Reading and Wonder Boys. Those are the kind of the dark humor that I'm going for.
So can you give us an example of kind of one of the scenes that really encompasses the dark humor of the film?
How many listeners do you have?
It's going to depend a bit on how you answer this question.
I'm hesitant to give too much away because it's still in the planning phases, but basically the professor is trying to get tenure, and he accidentally kills somebody, and instead of letting it impact his tenure case, he hides the body. And so these bodies start piling up over the course of the film.
Yeah, because of course, murders are like Pringles. It's kind of impossible to just have one, right?
That's right. They're so delicious.
But actually, that kind of raises an interesting question where, you talk about things transferring from screenplays to what you have available to make the movie. And kind of in that regard, writing a screenplay is a lot different from any other art medium because in many ways you're writing a recipe more than a final product. If everything goes correctly, nobody will read the screenplay. And so when you sit down to write that, kind of how much of it is just an inventory of what you'll be able to put on screen and how much is kind of like a wish list?
It's a little bit of both, but I would say, though, that when I sit down to write, I don't let anything, aside from like crazy stuff, like I know I'm not going to get access to a helicopter or, a big explosion. So like, I don't even like entertain those sort of things. So I am thinking about the characters first. Like, will you care about my people? And that's kind of my starting point. And I don't worry too much about what is good and what is bad. There's different ways of writing. Some people prefer to have an outline first, which is very smart, and people, figure out the plot points, then they go back and then they address those plot points. But for me, that's terribly boring. I don't like to write like that. I kind of just enjoy the process of learning who the people are by just living in their world while I'm writing. And that to me is really the fun part of it. But I definitely don't worry. Like my first draft, I know it's a first draft. I know it's crap, even though I think, oh, this is brilliant. And I start to ask questions like, oh, maybe I'm the one guy who has one draft and he's done. But that's not the way it works. But screenwriting is a different animal though, because you're right. Like if they say like people will read your script up to your first typo, and I am terrible about typos. I have typos everywhere. I really need people to sort of catch those for me. So the logistics of the story are I have an idea where I'm going to end, and I know where I'm starting, and then like I kind of figure out who it is. And so in my particular story that I'm writing now or wrote, I kind of stayed with this character throughout. Like he's on the screen, I'd say 98% of the time. And if he's not on the screen, what I think is that the audience will respond to, okay, I'm cutting to these other people now. And what that does subconsciously is like, oh, there's somebody at work here telling us what the story is about. And there's plenty of good films that do that. So I'm not saying that there's only one way to do it. But in this particular film, I felt like this guy is the main focus of the story. And every time I cut away from him, the audience is taken out a little bit and they have to kind of reassess and reevaluate. And so I tried to stay with this person that whole time. And so that was a conscious decision that I made as well. One of the biggest problems that I had in writing the film is, so I took a course with the Sundance Institute, which was really very helpful, some really good advice. But one of the big things that I walked away from with an unanswerable question is, how do you write tone? Like, how do you recognize tone? How do you write tone? And so I went back and I read a lot of scripts, like the ones I mentioned, Burn After Reading and the Coen brothers, other films, and Wonder Boys, and lots of films, right? And just trying to see how did those people write tone into their movie? Because that seems to be like, the readers who read scripts, the first thing they say is the tone's all over the place. Well, what is that? And how do they know? And so, what I after all my studying of this, I walked away thinking tone is really not on the page. It's really performance based often, like The Big Lebowski. When you read that script, it's not the same unless you see the guy deliver the lines.
For sure.
And so that was some of my bigger things that I really fought with.
Well, kind of in your experience then, when you're creating tone, or at least trying to create kind of a consistent enough vision for the rest of the crew to get what the film's about, do you find that it's more useful to sit down ahead of time and just think like, these are the words I'm going to use to express these concepts, these are the adjectives that are used to describe the characters, these are kind of like the 2 or 3 shots that I will build these scenes around? Or do you find it's more useful to go back afterwards and just kind of think how you can center that direction around what's shown up on screen, if that makes sense? Do you think it's constructive to try and figure out what the tone's going to be ahead of time, or do you think it's more constructive to keep meditating on that as you work on the film?
I would say the first draft, you just vomit it out,
Get
it onto paper, like don't worry too much about it at first, because it's all going to change anyway. But I do think that you should have a model in your mind. Like if you're writing a comedy, well, what kind of comedy? Is it like Airplane, or is it like The Big Lebowski? So I would say like having that model in your mind is helpful. So I would probably do it that way. But I do have, like, my process is really discovery. Like I'm discovering what these people are doing based on my background, and like, how would I respond to this? Or this guy is someone I knew, and this is how I think he would respond to this. But I don't have like words, but I might have a scene that I have in my mind that I want to get to. So how do I get there is one of the big problems or big challenge.
Well, then if I can go way, way back, kind of both to the interview and your earlier career, you mentioned you had some experience and got your start in documentary filmmaking, which for sure kind of has an expectation of honesty in a way that narrative fiction doesn't. Do you think there's any specific techniques or ways of approaching things that you picked up during documentary filmmaking that have translated well to your fiction narratives?
Probably. I would say that documentaries sort of train you in the field. Like
Sure.
it helped me more like on set where I can move quicker. I'm like, just get the shot, just turn on the camera, get it. Where the rest of the crew's like, wait a minute, I need to turn on this light and like, yeah, I want it to look beautiful. And so like, there's a balance between getting the shot right now versus, making it all perfect. And then we start running out of time. So it's more about that, because when you're editing a documentary, you're not working from a script. Like with a fiction piece, you have a blueprint of what the film is, where in a documentary, it's like you're basically figuring out often what like you have a theme and you have an idea, but it changes while you're editing it. And
sure.
it's much more complicated to edit a documentary than it is to edit a fiction piece, is my experience.
Well, thank you for sitting down with us. Once again, for all of you guys watching, this is David Liban, the writer-director behind A Feral World and the upcoming Publish or Perish. If you guys want to check out more of his stuff, it's going to be available in the links below this video. If you like this video, make sure to drop us a like and subscribe so other people can enjoy it as well. And consider heading over to our channel to check out some of our other content. We've got Parental Composure talking parroting, and we've got the double feature talking all things twins and pop culture. Once again, thank you for sitting down with us, David.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right, and I look forward to seeing what comes out of your workspace next.
Thank you.